Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me in this lesson. Today we are looking at clauses in English grammar. Now, before I talk about clauses, let me just remind you what we learned in the previous lesson. In the previous lesson, we looked at phrases, and we said that phrases or a phrase is a group of words that work as a single unit or as a unit. For example, if you say the bottle is a noun phrase. We have got the, an article, and bottle, a noun. That is a noun phrase. We can also say on the table. On the table is a prepositional phrase. Okay? Now, you can see the examples that I've given that they do not give us a complete thought or a complete meaning. Okay? But when we combine the two phrases and introduce a verb phrase, we are going to have a complete meaning or a complete thought. Let me give you that example. The bottle is on the table. Now that makes sense. And that, my friends, is a clause. Okay? If you are ready to learn about clauses in this lesson, then let's get started without wasting your time. What is a clause? A clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a predicate. I've introduced two new words in what I have said. I said a clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a predicate, and the two terms I've introduced are subject and a predicate. What is a subject? A subject is the performer of the action in a sentence. The subject is the performer of the action in a sentence. And what is a predicate? A predicate is everything that is mentioned after the subject. So if I say, she dances, she is the subject because she's the performer of the action. What action? Dancing. So in this sentence or in this clause, we have two words. But we can also say the bottle is on the table. In this case, the bottle is the subject, is on the table is a predicate. The bottle is a subject, is on the table is a predicate. Okay? Now, let's look at characteristics of clauses. Characteristic number one, as I've mentioned, is that a clause always has a subject and a predicate. Subject and a predicate. Example, Jesus wept. So there's Jesus, the performer of the action, wept, the predicate. Another example, my mother sent me to you. My mother sent me to you. So my mother is the subject. Sent me to you is the predicate. Let's look at characteristic number two. They express a complete or incomplete thought. Complete or incomplete thought. So this is what this means. A clause has a predicate and a subject. And in the examples that I gave you, the thought was complete. But there are times when we have clauses which do not express a complete thought. And these are called independent and dependent clauses. We are going to look at these two, and we are going to give you more examples. So two things you need to remember. Subject, a clause contains a subject and a predicate. Number two, a clause can have a complete or an incomplete thought. Okay? Now, let's understand characteristic number two further by looking at the types of clauses. Let's start by looking at independent clauses. Independent clauses. And sometimes independent clauses are referred to as main clauses. Okay? Okay, let's move on. An independent clause is a complete sentence. An independent clause is a complete sentence. Again, I've mentioned a third term. I am saying sentence. What is a sentence? A sentence is a group of words with a complete thought. So therefore, a clause is equal to a sentence in this case, because an independent clause is equal to a sentence because an independent clause gives a complete thought, just like a sentence gives a complete thought. It has a subject and a predicate, and it can stand alone. It can stand on its own. Let me give you examples. I enjoy reading is an independent clause. I enjoy reading is an independent clause. The sun is shining brightly. The sun is shining brightly. That is also an independent clause. An independent clause. Okay? And then sometimes we can combine clauses. We can combine clauses. Independent clauses can be joined to form compound sentences using coordinating conjunctions. We looked at conjunctions and we looked at types. So just go back into the lessons. You are going to find that lesson. But examples of coordinating conjunctions include and, but, or. Okay? This is going to make sense. Let me give you an example. I enjoy reading book. I enjoy reading, and she enjoys writing. You can see in this sentence, it's a compound sentence. We have two independent clauses, meaning that the clauses that we have can stand on their own. Let me break this down. I enjoy reading. We can end there. It makes sense. It's a complete thought. You can also say, she enjoys writing. We can end there. It makes sense. Therefore, those are two different independent clauses. But we can join them using a conjunction, a coordinating conjunction. As we have seen, I enjoy reading and she enjoys writing. Okay? Let's look at dependent clauses. Now, if you don't understand anything about sentences and compound sentences, it will be the next topic we'll be looking at. So if you are watching this video when the lesson on sentences has been made, then just go to my YouTube channel and watch that. You are going to make a lot of sense from that lesson. Okay? So let's proceed. Let's look at dependent clauses. A dependent clause is also called a subordinate clause because it cannot stand alone. It's a dependent. It depends on an independent clause. However, it's very important in the sense that it provides additional information and it must be attached to an independent clause. A dependent clause can give us information about the cause or the effect. It can give us information about condition. It can give us information about time. And these are just a few examples. So let me give you sentence examples or clause examples. Because it was raining, we stayed indoors. Because it was raining, we stayed indoors. Now, let's break this sentence down. Because it was raining, we've got it, which is the subject, and the raining, which is the verb. In short, it has got a it has got a subject and a predicate. When you say because it was raining, we've got a subject, we've got a predicate. But it doesn't make sense on its own. For it to make sense, it needs to depend on the other part, which is we stayed indoors. We stayed indoors, on the other hand, can stand on its own. It's an independent clause. And therefore, in this sentence, because it was raining, we stayed indoors. We stayed indoors is the main clause. Because it was raining is a dependent clause or subordinate clause. Let me give you another example concerning condition. If you study hard, you will pass the exam. If you study hard, you will pass the exam. Again, let's break down this sentence. If you study hard is a subordinate clause. You will pass the exam is an independent clause. Now, look at the way we are writing these sentences. Let me flip the second example. We can also say, you will pass the exam if you study hard. You will pass the exam if you study hard. If you look at this example, where I've started with the main clause, we do not need a comma to separate the main clause from the subordinate clause. But when we start with the subordinate clause, we need a comma to separate it from the main clause or the independent clause. Just look at this example on your screen and see how we have punctuated it. Let me give you a last example. When the bell rang, the students left. Again, when the bell rang is a dependent clause, is a subordinate clause. The students left is the main clause, is the independent clause in this sentence. Okay, so far we have looked at dependent and independent clauses, and we have seen how they differ in terms of whether they are completing a thought or not. Let's look at other types of clauses. We have what we call relative clauses. A relative clause provides extra information about a noun in the sentence. A relative clause provides extra information about a noun in the sentence. It begins with a relative pronoun like who, whom, whose, that, which. Now, relative clauses come in two types. They are what we call defining relative clauses and non-defining relative clauses. So let's look at defining relative clauses. Defining relative clauses provide essential information about a noun. In short, they define a noun. The information they give is very important for us to understand the noun. Without them, the sentence would be incomplete or unclear because we don't necessarily understand the noun. Let's look at examples. The book that I borrowed is interesting. The book that I borrowed is interesting. Let me rewind. At the beginning, when I talked about the relative clauses, I said they use relative pronouns like who, whom, whose, that, which. Therefore, in this sentence, the book that I borrowed is interesting. That I borrowed identifies which book, and that information is very important for us to know which book. Therefore, that I borrowed is a defining relative clause. Let me give another example. The teacher who helped me is very kind. Who helped me specifies which teacher. Therefore, who helped me in this sentence is a defining relative clause. Now let's move on and look at non-defining relative clauses. Non-defining relative clauses add extra non-essential information to a sentence. The information they add is extra but not essential. They are separated by commas. The examples that I gave you on defining relative clauses didn't have commas in them. But for defining relative clauses, I'm going to give you examples and I'm going to show you how we punctuate them. Okay, let me give you examples. My brother who lives in New York is visiting us this week. In this case, right, who lives in New York adds extra information about my brother. But that information is not very important in knowing this person because we know he's my brother. It's just extra information. Let me give you another example. The Eiffel Tower, which is located in Paris or Paris, is a famous landmark. Again, you can see we have added extra information, but not essential information, because honestly, everyone who knows about this tower knows where it is located. So adding that information is not essential. It's just extra information, and that information is separated from the rest of the sentence using commas, as you can see on the screen. Okay? Let me give you a last example of a defining relative clause and a non-defining relative clause. The man who won the race is my friend. The man who won the race is my friend. I think when we are talking about this man, it's very important to know that we're talking about the man who won the race. It's essential for us to identify the man. Therefore, who won the race is defining relative clause. Let me give you the last example on non-defining relative clauses. John, who won the race, is my friend. Oh, when we say John, we have already identified this person, so the information that we give about him is just extra. It doesn't really identify him, compared to the previous example where who won the race is a defining factor in that sentence. In this case, we have already identified this person, it's John, right? Therefore, we are just adding extra information. I hope that makes sense. Let me look at other relative structures. Relative clauses can sometimes omit the relative pronoun in informal contexts when it acts as the object. For example, the movie that we watched was amazing. This is how we write the movie that we watched. That's a defining relative clause, right? But we can also say the movie we watched was amazing. This is an informal way of saying things. You can say this when you are talking to your friends, when you are writing to your friends, but when you are writing formally, you should not drop that relative a conjunction, a relative or subordinative conjunction. We should not leave it out. Let me now move on to a different type of clauses. This type is called that clause. That clause. A that clause is a type of dependent clause introduced by the word that. We have looked at this already. It is commonly used to express statements, beliefs, or ideas. Now, listen to the way this one is used. It's very interesting. When you say, let me give you an example. She said that she would come to the party. She said that she would come to the party. You can see how we are using that to introduce a dependent clause. You can also say, that I am a driver is very interesting. That I am a driver is very interesting. It is important that you arrive on time. That you arrive on time is important. That you arrive on time is important. You see how we use this one. It's a bit tricky. If you don't understand, write questions for me in the comments. So the word that can often be omitted in informal speech, even in this case. For example, you can say, she said she would come to the party. She said she would come to the party. Okay, this is the last type of clause that we are going to look at. Thank you so much for joining me in this lesson. I'm going to see you in the next lesson, where we are going to start looking at a very important topic. We are looking at sentences. And as I promised, the next lesson is going to be about sentences. If you're watching this video at the time when I've done this lesson, I'm sure you'll find it in the description. I've linked it. If not, wait for it. Thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye.